Good evening and welcome to the Northwestern Michigan College International Affairs Forum live from the beautiful Traverse City Opera House. My name is Jim Bensley and I'm the director of the International Affairs Forum. Tonight, our conversation will have a conversation with former ambassador to Mexico, Anthony Wayne, and it will be in a hybrid format with an in-person audience as well as those joining us on a virtual platform. Please note that both our in-person audience and the guests on coming through virtually will have a chance to ask questions of the presenter. Those of you that are coming through virtually will enter your question in the chat box, but please try and hold those till after the presentation. And those of you here with us this evening will have a chance to actually step up to the microphone on each side of the stage and state your question when the time comes. And now, let me introduce a man who has represented the United States in many corners of the world. Ambassador Wayne served as a U.S. diplomat from 1975 to 2015, including as ambassador to Argentina, coordinating director for development and economic affairs, and deputy ambassador in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011, and ambassador to Mexico from 2011 to 15. He was an assistant secretary of state for economic and business affairs under 3 secretaries of state and principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Europe from 1997 to 2000. The U.S. Senate confirmed him as a career ambassador, the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service in 2010. Anthony received multiple honors during his government service, including the 2017 Director General's Cup for the Foreign Service and the 2015 Cobb Award for Initiative and Success in Trade Development. Wayne is currently a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and co-chair of its Mexico Institute Advisory Board. He is a senior non-resident advisor at the Atlantic Council and at the Center for Security and International Studies, and also a faculty member in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Wayne has an MPA from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, MAs in political science from Princeton University and Stanford University, and a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of California, Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Anthony Wayne.
Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, at least virtually, in this beautiful opera house. I can see some of it from the photos. So this evening, we have the pleasure of talking about a very important relationship between the United States and its southern neighbor. And we're doing this just 2 days before the President of Mexico, the Prime Minister of Canada, and the President of the United States are going to meet in Washington, D.C. So there's a lot that they'll be talking about that we'll talk about tonight. So a really key thing for you to know about is that our relationship with Mexico touches the daily lives of more citizens of the United States than any other relationship we have in the world. And that's because we have so many different overlapping ties, historical ties, family ties, trade relationships, tourism. There are many, many good things that go across our 2,000-mile border and some bad things that go across that border. We have 11% of the US population is of Mexican heritage. We deal with a whole range of issues, and we've had ups and downs in this relationship. We had a very good period from 2010 through 2016 of trying to work together constructively on a whole range of issues. And then we had a more challenging period in the last 4 years, except during that period, we did negotiate a new version of the trade agreement between the three countries of North America. But we have a lot of issues to manage, and this slide just gives you an idea of the range of those issues that go from bouncing back from, hopefully soon, from the pandemic, dealing with all of the trade that crosses this border, including the drugs that cross the border, building new cooperation in a whole range of ways. So let's start here looking at trade for just a minute. What you can see is that this is a really important relationship. Mexico is the second largest export market of the United States. It's the second largest agricultural export market. Canada is usually number one in this, but overall in sales from us and imports from Mexico, Mexico is number one through September of this year. China was number one in 2020 and Mexico was number one in 2019. So this is a really big relationship, and you can see here just some numbers, but the easiest way to remember this is that every minute, $1 million of trade crosses the border between the United States and Mexico. So in the several minutes that we've been talking here, let's say, so maybe $5 million of trade has crossed that border. So this is a really big relationship. And during normal times, i.e. pre-pandemic times, each day there are 1 million border crossings. Sometimes some of that are people crossing from north to south or south to north and coming back again. But this is a very busy border, and it's busy because of all the trade that goes on, and it's busy because of the communities along the border that really interact with each other on a daily basis as part of their daily lives. This trading relationship has grown immensely from the early 1990s. It's multiplied by 6 since the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1994. And as you can see from the recession in 2008, 2009, there was a big increase in that trade, going up over 56% in those intervening years. Now you can see at the very end that, not surprisingly, there was a decline from 2019 to 2020 because of the pandemic, which had a big effect on everybody's economy. So you can see here that in the trading relationship, Mexico and Canada are number 1 and 2 trading partners, pretty close together. And then comes China, and then you have a big drop off down to the next 2 countries that we trade with, Japan and Germany. So our neighbors are very important. And when we look at the next slide, please, what you can see is this is why they're so important. This is the percentage of a dollar's worth of finished goods that come back from every country in the world. How much of that is what the United States has contributed? So for every dollar of a finished manufacturing product coming back from Mexico, about 40% is US product or US value added, and about 25% of that product if it's coming from Canada. And then you can see all the other countries in the world. It's a big drop off. We really produce things together with our 2 neighbors, and that's one of the key things to remember. So another thing that most people don't appreciate is that there are over 5 million US jobs that depend on this trade with Mexico. And this is a big jump from in 1993, when we started the North American Free Trade Agreement. There were only about 700,000 jobs depending on our trade with Mexico. So, and we can talk about this later, but contrary to Ross Perot's famous comment about a great sucking sound from Mexico, we've actually grown many jobs, more jobs than we've lost in trading with Mexico. Now, the challenge is that some of the jobs that were lost, a number of those, the new jobs that were created were not in the places where those jobs, those manufacturing plants closed and moved south. And when I say south, not only south to Mexico, south to the southern United States also. So these are the biggest states that trade with the United States. And you're not surprised, I'm sure, to see California and Arizona and Texas there. But as you can see, there are a bunch of states very close to where you live that are major traders with Mexico. And that's because we have very integrated production chains, especially in the auto area. And this is just to make the point that if you took all the border states between the United States and Mexico on both sides of the border, put them together and they were one country, they would have the third largest economy in the world. So there's a lot of activity, economic activity going on both sides of that border between the United States and Mexico. One other thing that's very important in this relationship is that Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States send a lot of money home to their families. And so in 2020, during the pandemic, they sent about $40 billion back to Mexico to help their family members back there. And as you can see from this, that was a record number of a record amount being sent back. Okay, now let's look at the border. So border management is very complex. It's just about 2,000 miles long. You can see here are all the formal crossings are marked on this slide. And of those crossings, the formal crossings are where all the trade in regular goods go. And very interestingly, most of the trade in hard drugs also cross through these formal border crossing places. They don't go in between. People sometimes go in between, and marijuana used to go in between because it was very bulky. But the really deadly drugs, heroin and fentanyl and cocaine also, come through hidden in cargo or hidden in trucks or hidden in cars. So this is really where we need to focus enforcement, and we need to focus efforts to facilitate legitimate trade and legitimate passage. A lot of that legitimate travel across the border, just to note, before the pandemic was in visitors. And you can see here that there were a lot of overnight visitors. There were about 40 million from the United States going to Mexico and about 18 million coming from Mexico to the United States. And altogether, these visitors spent over $40 billion in both economies. So it's a big part of what's goes on between the two countries. This is just to show you the rise in trucks going across the border. You can see how steep that is, and that reflects the trade. There's a tremendous amount of goods, and most of it comes by truck. Some comes by rail, but most by truck. And this is just to give you an idea of apprehensions of migrants at our border. And we'll have a chance to talk about this in more detail. But this goes from 1960 through 2020. So what you can see is a steadily increasing number of Mexicans coming in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, reaching a peak about 2000, and then headed downward since then. And the number of Mexicans also headed downward, especially with a turning point about 2007. And then those black tips on the lines in recent years are non-Mexicans who've come across. And what you can see is a much larger proportion of migrants at the southwest border have been from countries other than Mexico. So just to explore a little bit this trend, there's been up until the last couple of years, there was a steady decline in the number of Mexicans net flow in the United States. A number of Mexicans decided they wanted to go home after being in the United States. When they were interviewed, they indicated that, well, they really hadn't wanted to live in the United States. They just wanted to work and send money home. But after the United States changed its approach to immigration, they couldn't go back and forth. But finally, they'd worked long enough, they'd sent enough money home, and a lot of them decided to go back. In the last couple of years, there's been a rise in single males, mostly coming across the border. And this is probably due to the pandemic. There was a big economic recession in Mexico. People were looking for jobs, and a lot of them tried to come into the United States. A number of them tried several times, and Mexicans are returned immediately to Mexico when they're apprehended. This shows, you can see the number of unauthorized immigrants in the United States. This is an estimate, of course, because we don't know exactly. But you can see the sort of yellowish, orangish line are Mexicans. So the high point of Mexicans in the United States irregularly was in 2007. And it declined, as you can see, through 2017. And in 2016, there were more non-Mexicans in the United States in an unauthorized status than Mexicans. And most of those people did not actually cross one of the borders. They came in by air travel. And they also, most of them also came in with visas and then overstayed their visas. So this is just a quick look at what we tried to do on the border in the last 3 presidencies. President Obama tried to mix enforcement and cooperation and to facilitate legitimate trade and travel. And that meant agreeing with the Mexicans on an approach where we would talk about shared responsibilities and go beyond criticizing each other to try to find solutions to both managing illicit travel and illicit trade in drugs and guns and money, and find solutions to try to make things better. And that included managing the first big surge in Central American migrants, which came in 2014, 2015. You may remember that. Those were largely teenagers and then many mothers with young children. President Trump, as you I'm sure remember, shifted to a sharp focus on enforcement, wanting to build the wall along the whole border, threatening to impose tariffs on all of Mexico's exports to the United States, and then getting an agreement to a wait in Mexico policy where people seeking asylum had to wait on the Mexican side of the border. President Biden came in with a desire to replace Trump's harsh methods, but was immediately faced with a surge of migrants, which started while Trump was still president. And that included migrants from Central America, from Mexico, and from other places, as you may remember in the news within the last month or so, with 15,000 or so Haitians, which showed up at the border. He also came in with a commitment to try to work again on the root causes that were pushing people out of the northern part of Central America, which President Obama had also tried to do. So what this slide shows you, I'll let you take a moment to look at this. The top line is this last fiscal year, FY 2021, which ended on October 1st. The next line down is 2019, below that 2018, and the lowest line 2020, when COVID hit and we had harsh restrictions in place. So you can see the different levels of people being apprehended at the border. What we saw this last year, where there were fewer families, there were more adults, more Mexicans, and more from places other than Central America. And most of the people who were apprehended were sent back, most of those under a health provision, which we can talk about because COVID was in place. And there were also many more repeated apprehensions, people who tried to come a couple of times across the border. This is just to give you an idea so you can visualize that mix of migrants. You can see in 2019 in the middle, There were many families. That's the light blue color. The dark blue color are unaccompanied children. And then the reddish color below are single adults. So you can see that in the second half of 2020 and 2021, there were many more single adults trying to come across the border. And that's probably because people were looking for jobs, as distinguished from fleeing violence or other disruption. So this is just to show you, this is an indication of how many people were sent back for under COVID rules for health reasons. You can just see there were most of the expulsions during this period of time, during the COVID period, has been for health reasons, which allowed for immediate expulsion. Next slide, please. Now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about crime on the border. Next slide. So there are several very important reasons why we need to work together against crime. So what this shows you, a big reason we should pay attention are overdose deaths in the United States, because this is a good indication of drug abuse in the United States. And there are several things of interest here, I think, for you to understand the size of this problem. The blue line in the middle, which goes is high until the very end. These are the number of people that died after getting prescription opioids in the United States, i.e. they got things from drugstores and doctors and others and then overdosed on it. So what happened was that the drug smugglers in Mexico started seeing how many Americans they started sensing were using opioids. And so they first decided that they wanted to get in on this drug abuse market. And so they started growing more opium in Mexico and producing heroin. And that's the dark green line that you can see rising from about 2010 to about 2016, 15 or 16. And then they got another idea, which was they started seeing that there were synthetic opioids being made in China, that these were much more potent. They only had to smuggle a little bit, and they would be could be sold in the United States. But the thing about them is they're much more lethal than heroin or the prescription opioids. So you can see that yellow line soaring upward. That's the number of overdose deaths in the United States from these synthetic opioids. Now, these opioids came in through our mail system. They came in through Canada, but most of them came in through Mexico, facilitated by Mexico transnational criminal organizations. And what you can see is during the last year, during the COVID crisis, there was about a 20% jump in those deaths, up to 93,000 in drug deaths overall, most of that coming from these synthetic opioids. So this is another way to look at those same figures. So you can think about it a little bit differently. The top line is total opioids, and the next line down are synthetic opioids. So you can see by the curve of those two lines that it's really synthetic opioids that are driving overdose deaths in the United States over the past 5 or so years. So in Mexico, what is driving them to want to cooperate with us isn't overdose deaths, but it is the violence that comes from these criminal groups trying to secure routes to smuggle drugs to the United States. And that means that they fight with other drug groups, they fight with local authorities, they spend some of their profits from the United States to buy arms and to fuel corruption in Mexico. And so what this shows is how many people in Mexico are scared in their own cities. How many feel insecure in the cities in which they live. And that number right now is about 65% of Mexicans. Then this is another measure of why they're afraid. These are the number of homicides, yearly homicide totals in Mexico. And you can see there's a first rise around 2010, 2011. And that was when President Calderon in Mexico started going after the drug cartels. And then he really got better control of this, and it started to go down. But then in 2014, they started to rise, and they 3 years reached record highs. And the number of homicides, most of which are involve criminal activity, and particularly organized criminal activity. You also see a rise in the number of internally displaced persons, which is what IDPs stands for. So there are about 350,000 Mexicans who felt the need to flee their cities or their communities because of the violence there. There we go. Okay, so this is another way of looking at these high homicide rates. But I just flagged two things on here that are in yellow. It's estimated that the drug cartels make $19 to $30 billion a year from their sales inside the United States, and that the violence generated around their networks in Mexico are estimated to cost Mexico about 22.5% of their GDP. So there's a lot of money being made, and there's a lot of cost involved in this criminal network that goes from Mexico to the United States and then back again to the United States in the form of money and illegal arms. And this just shows the last 3 Mexican presidents have experienced rising crime that has gone along with this. So what the United States and Mexico tried to do first to handle this rise in criminal activity was set up a cooperative program called the Merida Initiative. This was the first time that there'd been cooperation between the two governments. And part of it was trying to deal with the organized crime groups. Part of it was trying to help Mexico establish better rule of law, better respect for human rights. Part of it was to build a more modern border, because we have really a 19th century border between the two countries. And then part of it was to go into helping communities that were really suffering because of the criminal violence. So our Congress has approved a little over $3.2 billion for this since 2008, as you can see, but the Mexicans have spent about 10 times that in their efforts. So what happened over the past 4 years was basically the United States did not have fighting crime as their highest priority. The highest priority was on migration and the border. Mexico got a new president that was very skeptical about the Merida Initiative and about cooperating with the United States, and really was not interested. Cooperation deteriorated. When the Biden administration came in, they've spent a number of months trying to reinitiate a dialogue, and just in October, there was a ministerial level dialogue between both governments, and they agreed to try to launch a new framework to fight these criminal activities. And officials are working right now to define an action agenda to try and rejuvenate this cooperation. So this new framework is called, a really catchy title, Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities. And as you can tell from the title, it's aimed at looking at all parts of the chain that brings this pain to both countries: drug use, overdoses, as well as supply. And it's aimed at going after all the bad things that happen along the chain of drugs flowing north and guns coming back, and improving the ability to investigate homicides and find the illicit money. So we'll see what what happens from this? The proof is really going to be if they come up with an effective action plan and then implement it and start producing results in all these areas, including bringing more people to justice. So now we're going to talk about trade. So we talked a little bit about U.S.-Mexico. So we're across the whole continent, which is what the North American Free Trade Agreement did, and now something called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement does, is it really linked all three of the countries together. So that's, as you can see, 3.6 billion a day flows. About 12 million U.S. jobs are supported by trade with Canada and Mexico, and about 50% of this trade is in what is called intermediate goods, meaning they go into a final good produced elsewhere. So another indication of how much we make together. This trade's grown about 4 times since the beginning of NAFTA. And one of the very interesting things about this is, there was a lot of criticism of NAFTA when it existed. This was a study done in 2014 about each year, what each country gains or what they would lose if NAFTA hadn't existed. So the estimate of these studies was that each year the US gets $127 billion extra because NAFTA existed, Mexico $170 billion, and Canada $50 billion. And that works out to about $400 that wouldn't be there for each person in the United States if we didn't have NAFTA. Really quickly, these are just the top trading partners of both Canada and Mexico. You can see that the top 3 are the same, and then there's a little variety of in order, but a lot of the same states. So they started renegotiating NAFTA. As you remember, President Trump threatened to pull out of NAFTA, and but he then heard from farmers and companies and others saying, "What are you doing? These are our biggest trading partners." And so they did renegotiate, and it was finished and went into force in July of 2020. The implementation was slowed because of COVID, and then by the transition in between U.S. presidents. So most of USMCA is a modernized version of NAFTA because NAFTA had to be updated after 25 years. There were just so many things that had changed in international trade, such as digital trade. Think in 1993, how much trade was there across the internet? How much e-commerce was there? How much did you buy on the internet? Not much, but now all sorts of things happened there. So all of that needed to be updated. The biggest change probably is in the rules for what counts as a North America car or truck, and thus if it gets tariff-free treatment. And so the rule change was basically to mean more stuff had to be built, had to be provided in North America, and more of the material had to come from the United States or Canada because the workers had to earn an average of over $16 an hour. There were a few other changes, but we can talk about more of them if you're interested. So at the end of all this, as you can see, most Americans thought trade with our 2 neighbors was good for us. And what happened through a lot of this period is there was so much debate about NAFTA and trade that I think a lot of people just learned that Canada and Mexico were our largest trading partners and a lot of jobs depended on it, and they didn't know that before. So right now the governments are trying to implement this new trade agreement. They're trying to get ready to come back from COVID-19. COVID-19 reminded everybody we needed better supply chains, more resilient supply chains, and smarter, better, more modern borders. There are individual concerns. There are concerns, as you can see here, some with Mexico, some with the United States, and some with Canada. And we can talk about those in more detail if you're interested. But the biggest gain from the point of view of US business and farmers was that there was certainty as to what the rules were. And so they can now plan and invest and build their business with an idea that they have at least 16 years that these rules are going to be in place. NAFTA, the USMCA, however, wasn't enough. So because we have such a massive economic relationship, and trade doesn't really encompass all of it. So the US and Mexico just relaunched something that existed, that was created during the Obama years, called the High Level Economic Dialogue. And this is to deal with a lot of the other issues that go way beyond trade ministers. So that's like actually encouraging these stronger supply chains, getting back to building better facilities and better processes at the border. We also agreed, we put in here that we're going to try to work together to invest in Central America and Southern Mexico to keep some of those migrants down there, to give them some jobs in that area. We're going to work together on things like cybersecurity, which can attack anywhere across North America. And then there was a recognition also that we had to invest better in our people. With technology and industry changing all the time, we really needed to focus more and talk about workforce development. How are we training people? And we really haven't been talking about that at all between the countries. Okay, very quickly, a little bit on Mexico's government. So the president of Mexico is a gentleman named Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. He won 53% of the vote in 2018 and won a large majority in Congress, and a majority, but not a large majority, in the Senate. Mexico just had its midterm elections. AMLO, as Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, known as AMLO, his coalition retained a majority in the lower house of Congress, but not the 2/3 they need to change the Constitution. So now they need allies to have any major constitutional change. One of the amazing things about AMLO is how popular he has remained. You can see here his popularity has stayed over 60%, even through the COVID period, in which many thousands of Mexicans were dying, and in which the economy crashed terribly. He has a wonderful ability to communicate. He has press conferences 5 mornings a week, early in the morning, and he's just won the hearts and holds the hearts of many Mexicans, even if they aren't happy with what's going on. So there are a number of criticisms of AMLO. He has too much power concentrated around him. During the COVID period, he didn't actually spend more money. He, unlike the United States, which put a lot of money into the economy, he didn't do that, and economic growth dropped 8.5%. He wants to restore control of the state over the oil and electricity sectors, which a lot of people don't like. There are a number of questions of things he's doing, including reducing the power of it. But despite that, he remains very popular. Just quickly, economy and the environment. In fact, we can go really fast through this, but during the COVID period, the economy not only dropped 8.5%, poverty rate increased from 37 to 40%, and 6.3 million people fell out of the middle class. So this was a really serious blow. And the Mexican government, like many other governments, was sharply criticized for its mishandling of the COVID situation, saying that many more people died. As you can see here, one report said 190,000 people died that could have been avoidable. The economy is bouncing back. It's expected to grow 6% this year. But there are still a lot of recommendations for reforms which don't seem that they will be followed. Just give you a couple more things about migration, because I know you're interested in migration. The United States has not had a major migration reform since 1986. There were a couple of minor ones in 1990 and 1996. There have been flaws in our approach to migration and a lot of criticism of it, but efforts to achieve an agreement on reform during the Bush and Obama years floundered. Rather, migration has become more and more polarized, which makes it very hard to come up with good solutions. As you know, Obama tried to do a mix of increased enforcement and gestures to care about migrants, such as the DACA effort to help children who, or yeah, people who come here as children. Um, Trump turned to very harsh measures, which we can talk about, and Biden is trying to figure out a middle way forward, but so far he's getting attacked from the left and the right, either for not doing enough or in one way or not doing enough in another way. Happy to talk about that though as we go on. So this just shows you, it lets you look again at the numbers over the past 2 years. You can see the giant surge in this year. And this shows you the problem we have in our own immigration system. This is the backlog of cases waiting to have a hearing for asylum requests. And we just increasingly have not been able to work this system effectively. And we have not been willing to invest enough people and resources to make it work better and more quickly. So Biden hopes that he can deal with this. He's asked for $4 billion in aid, $1 billion a year, to invest in the Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to try to deal with the problems that are pushing people out. He's seeking closer cooperation with Mexico and getting them to help manage this. He's seeking broader regional cooperation to try and get some agreed norms with other countries. And as you may know, there are very sizable migrant problems and challenges in other areas. Colombia has several million migrants from Venezuela, for example. He wants to try to encourage better governance in these countries, as well as investing in their economies, but also investing in their services in dealing with migrants and refugees and human rights. One of the options to be considered is improving and expanding our temporary work programs, which work very well for Mexico, and Mexico and Canada have an exemplary seasonal work program. And then also we need to invest in our own asylum system and our infrastructure for dealing with immigrants when they arrive at the borders. So right now, Biden administration and the AMLO administration, they're working in the economic area, this high-level economic dialogue. They're working in the security area, in the high-level security dialogue. They're trying to work on supply chains, on USMCA enforcement. They're trying to work on migration. They're also working on missing persons cases and human smuggling and human trafficking. And the United States has become the biggest donor of COVID vaccine to Mexico. And they're actually in Mexico, they're starting to get a hold of this COVID situation in a much better way than they had before. Okay, this is sort of saying the same thing, things we need to work on. So we can wrap up now, and I'm happy to take your questions. And I'm so sorry that we had these technical challenges, and thanks to your team there for going through all of these. But I'd be very happy to take your questions and talk about these issues.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wayne. That was a lot of information, a lot of good information. I think we appreciate all that you were able to provide. But now let's see what the audience has to say, the questions that they may have. So we're going to take the first question from our in-person audience. If you want to, I see your hand is up. If you want to make your way to one of the microphones.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. Between California and Mexico, isn't there a wall that's there that has been extremely effective?
There is a wall. So the difference in my mind is that in certain very intense urban areas, walls can make sense because they stop a lot of things from going across. They can stop drugs, and they can stop arms, and they can stop people. In vast open rural areas, it's probably, my belief is it's much more effective to use smart walls, meaning using sensors and rapid response and other things to deal with people who are trying to cross or vehicles that are trying to cross. And we now have the capacity to do that. And that actually, in my view, is a much more agile and a cost-effective way of dealing with some of these challenges than trying to build a big wall across the whole border. There are I'm just adding, walls in some places make sense in very urban and relatively highly populated areas. In other places, I don't think they make sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from one of our virtual viewers. Can the issues with unscheduled migration from Mexico into the US be truly addressed as long as the economies in Mexico and the Northern Triangle continue to underperform?
I don't think migration problems anywhere are going to be fully addressed as long as there are differences in the human situation in different countries. I think people will move when they are threatened or feel threatened or feel they can't survive. And so implicit in your question is correct. Yes, it makes a lot of sense to encourage more prosperity in other countries to the degree that we can do that. And in our immediate neighbor, that makes a lot of sense. We have a great deal of to gain if our neighbor is relatively prosperous, not only from migration, but from the stability, I think, that comes from having prosperous neighbors. And that's true for Central Americans and others. So I think I fully support the idea that we should look for ways to have people have more prosperous and safer lives in their home countries. And I think this is the same problem that the Europeans are facing from a lot of neighboring regions, and that we're going to see increasingly because of the additional factor of climate change, which will, I think, help generate some political instability and will challenge economies around the world. So I don't think this is a problem that's going to get smaller. I think it's a problem that's probably going to remain constant and spread to different places than we've seen it before.
Thank you. Do we have another question from the audience? Please make your way right up to the microphone. And
thank you for your presentation today, Ambassador Wayne. I think we've all really enjoyed it. My question has to do with free trade agreements. I think for a lot of us, it's relatively well known who the winners and losers in the United States have been. And we've kind of seen some of the domestic political fallout that's come from organized groups of people that have been disenfranchised. So my question has to do with, on the Mexican side, who have been the winners as well as the losers of those agreements, and has it had the same type of domestic political cost?
Well, I think that there were different winners and losers along the route. Initially, for example, it was believed that many of the losers in Mexico were in the rural areas where farmers were, subsistence farmers especially, were seeing their life disrupted, in part because of more corn and other grains coming from the United States. But Mexico actually adapted very effectively, and they now have an agricultural surplus with the United States. For example, if you go to your grocery store, your Costco, and buy some berries, they're probably from Mexico. And in a number of these areas, they're actually quite, they fit quite well with production cycles in the United States to help meet consumer demands. So while initially people thought that agriculture was an area with a lot of suffering created by NAFTA, if they now look at it, there's actually a lot of prosperity created by the North American marketplace. And when they've done more serious studies of what happened in the rural areas of Mexico, they see that a lot of this was going on anyway, independently of NAFTA, even if NAFTA might have somewhat contributed, because of the transformations going on in a modernizing society in Mexico. So yes, there were winners and losers. The other big winner in Mexico were the northern states closer to the United States and the center of Mexico, which is where most of the NAFTA generated industries were, and the south of Mexico, which was already less developed, has remained less developed. And part of the reason is that the government has actually not built infrastructure going in those areas. They have very poor school systems, and companies have not wanted to, or have not been incentivized to invest in those areas. So that's one of the aims of the current president of Mexico, is to increase that investment. And it was actually an aim of the last president of Mexico also. It's been very hard for them to get a hold of that. And the same thing in the United States. I mean, my view in the United States is this is an issue that was handled very poorly by Republican and Democrat administrations. They did not have a policy to support communities that were losing investment, and investment was shifting elsewhere. And those communities were left to suffer. And as we know, there were a lot of very justifiably unhappy people who felt left behind because of that change. But I think it's important to know that when people have actually studied where jobs went, that it's really hard to find the mega effect of NAFTA one way or the other. Most of the change came from technological evolutions that eliminated jobs in manufacturing in the United States. And the other big notable effect was the arrival of China, which actually has been found to account for 12 to 15% of the job loss in the first decade or so of this century.
Thank you. We have another one from our virtual audience. I think it's very good. How has the legalization of marijuana affected the drug trade?
I think it's affected it by reducing the value of marijuana for Mexicans to smuggle into the United States. I mean, it does still happen, but they now face, it's not nearly as profitable a market as it was before. And sadly, I guess we could add, that's why a number of them have shifted to more deadly drugs, to heroin and then to fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. And cocaine continues to come in. That's mainly from the Andean region passing through Mexico to get the United States.
Great. Any other oh, we've got someone over here. Please step up to the mic.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Continuing along this vein, it's my understanding that the two biggest ports on the Pacific are actually owned by cartels, and that most of the precursor chemicals for fentanyl come from China through those ports. Other than trying to limit demand in the US, which I know is really what drives this whole thing, what would you suggest we might be able to do, or are there any options politically? Thank you.
Yes, I think you meant owned in the sense of control. Well, one of the things the Mexican government recently has done is put their Navy in charge, SAMAR in charge of ports, because they've also realized that the civilian authorities weren't able to get control of this. And one of the areas identified in the new high-level security dialogue is indeed improving port security. So right now, US and Mexican officials are trying to identify ways that they can increase cooperation in the ports. And there is a lot that can be increased because there's a lot of corruption there, as well as intimidation. And so what cartels do in general is they combine threats to people's lives and to the lives of their family with offers of money if people cooperate. And that combination, sadly, is pretty effective in a lot of areas. And the Mexican government has not been able to respond effectively to that for a lot of reasons. Right now, this government is putting more and more authority in the hands of its military to try to handle this, which is not the solution that most governments have taken. They've invested more in civilian law enforcement authorities, but this government in Mexico is putting, as I say, relying more and more on their military. They still will have a big challenge, but it is quite possible that with a combination of better intelligence, better training, and better cooperation, that you can improve the performance at these ports, as well as improve the ability to intercept the drugs at various stages along the path before they get to the users. But it's not going to be easy. And as I regularly say to people, we have to remember that President Nixon declared the war on drugs. That's a long time ago. People have been working really hard, many courageous people giving up their lives to try and stop drugs. And we can't end stopping it, but we have to be inventive in new ways of handling this problem, which I believe is a lot more investment in ways to reduce the demand side of this, the use of this. And we should be open to trying other things along the way and just see if we can't get some improvement, because I've worked very closely with many very courageous and hardworking people, and they're going to continue to do that, but it's not enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. Just to add a little bit to that, just recently, I think it was today, that Rosalinda Gonzalez, the wife of the most wanted man in Mexico, they call El Mencho, was captured by Mexican authorities, and he, I'm sure you know who he is. So maybe that will bode well for curtailing the drug trade a little bit. We can only hope. So we have time for just a couple more questions. I'm going to take one from our virtual audience. What is Mexico doing to help the Central American economies?
Well, Mexico has a modest effort to help the Central American economies. They have a couple of programs. One is planting trees that to produce income for poor communities, and they have an aid program where they've given, I think, $25 million to El Salvador, and I think some others, to try and do that. But they really don't have, one of the challenges is they don't have a development assistance agency that is very capable. They have one, but they don't give out many aid, and they don't have a history in giving out aid. So that does limit what they can do. They are trying to promote some business investment in both southern Mexico and the northern three countries in Central America and integrate that economic network between the two countries. But I'd say there's a lot to do there still. They've indicated that they are happy to have Central Americans come and work in southern Mexico if the Mexicans can get some investment and get jobs created, which would be a plus. But really and I guess they would join in the coalition to try and help those countries of Central America. But most of the money and technical assistance will need to come from others, including the United States.
Thank you. Do we have one more in the back?
Ambassador Wayne, could you talk a little bit about comprehensive immigration reform, and why is it such a challenge? It seems to be a complete minefield for our politicians on both sides. I really would like more information on what the impediments are.
Yeah, I'd like to understand why also people can't sit down and come up with common sense solutions to dealing with these problems. I mean, it seems to me you should be able to get a bipartisan group of experts together and come up with plans of how to do this that would have a mix of people to come for a temporary period of time, maybe in a rotation of coming for some time and going back, of that where there are needed jobs for the United States, of having a system whereby people with higher skills that are really in need could be prioritized. You do have to have a solution to, are you going to regularize? How are you going to deal with the people that are already here, the sort of 12 million or so people from all over the world that are here on an irregular status? And it really seems to me it is just that people are seeing political gain in trying to mobilize parts of their base by one or another extreme position on this, and it's been just impossible to reduce that polarization in our Congress. I wish we could find a way forward. As you may remember, the last time this happened that we got close was when a number of senators, which included Senator John McCain, came up with a compromise proposal that passed the Senate and then could not get any momentum at all in the House of Representatives. And I certainly in today's political atmosphere, very sadly, I don't see much prospects for comprehensive reform or for coming up with that more middle of the road proposal that would meet some of the needs that are out there.
But we can still hope. I think, yes.
And we can keep working, and someday, like on many issues, we are wise enough, and we've done this in the past, that we can get back to it. I see one other question here about gun sales. This is another.
Sure, go ahead.
Another issue that should be much easier to deal with, except it runs into some of these polarized differences. I mean, people are buying guns in the United States under false pretenses and then shipping them across the border, smuggling them into Mexico. And there are limits on what the United States, any US authority can do until they have to find the guns right at the border going in, given the current restrictions. And this is because of constitutional concerns that have limited what our federal authorities can do. And on the Mexican side, they really have not invested as much as they should in the checks right at the border either, to catch a number of these guns, excuse me, tied to funding from drugs. So recently, some of you may have read, the Mexican government has brought a suit in Massachusetts against one of the big gun manufacturers that's based there, with the idea that they are being irresponsible in allowing their guns to be sold to questionable vendors who are selling to questionable people. And so we'll see how this court suit fares. I think the Mexicans are trying to raise consciousness about the damage that these US guns are causing in Mexico, and that there does, in their view, and I think arguably, needs to be much more care about where our guns go and who's buying them and using them. But again, this is part of a very emotional debate in the United States, and it is hard to get consensus.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wayne. I'm sure the presentation tonight will elicit much conversation over the holiday weekend. So we appreciate your insight and your experience that you shared with us tonight. Thank you to the NMC students who joined us this evening, to the team at Traverse Area Community Media for your work on the coordination of this event, to all our members and future members, and to Alex Tank at IEF for his work in helping us put this all together. Remember to join us again this Thursday, as IEF partners with the National Writers Series for a virtual conversation with author Omar El Akkad, author of What Strange Paradise, the story of a refugee from Syria washed up on the shores of a very unfamiliar locale. For all IEF Diplomat, Ambassador, and Envoy members, please, we'll give you a 10-minute break and then join us for our Leadership Circle conversation with Ambassador Wayne. Again, thank you all for coming out. For all of you tuning in virtually, we hope to see you in February.